So, good evening, and thanks for joining us again. We are Barnform Publishing, and tonight we're joined by Andrew Karsgaard to discuss his new book. So, Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you first to introduce yourself and a bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. My name's Andrew Karsgaard. I live in Canada at the moment, but I grew up in India, Germany, and Scotland, and went to university in Scotland, and since then have sort of divided my time between Canada and Scotland. I had as I mentioned, university in Scotland, studied history there, including some military history, and then have had a career in the financial services industry and a hobby of military history.
Very good. And obviously this is your first book, so it's called Laugh and Be
Yeah.
Happy. It's the story of the first Lothians and Border Yeomanry in France, 1940. So how did this journey start for this book?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned growing up, we moved around a lot, but my mother's family is from East Lothian and Berwickshire, the sort of southeastern corner of Scotland. So we used to go back there for holidays quite a lot. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but
yeah,
in an Army Navy surplus store in Coldstream, where my aunt lived at the time, I found this, which is the cap badge of the Lothians and Border Yeomanry. It's a wheat sheaf, which is about the most unmilitary sort of symbol that I can think of. And I was intrigued by it. It was clearly local. I could tell that it came from East Lothian, from the borders. And so I sort of started to pull that thread and do research on the Lothians. I requested war diaries from the archives. I looked at newspaper archives from the time as I started to learn about them. I found a wonderful website called the First Lothian and Border Yeomanry.co.uk, where I learned about what happened to them in France in 1940. And that story, where of the 450 who went overseas, only 20 made it back to Scotland in 1940, just intrigued. It fascinated me. So I felt compelled to keep going and learn more about that story, you know, of the Lothians after Dunkirk, remaining in France. And as I say, of that 450 number, only 20 of them making it out.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that stands out with this book is some of the primary material you've had access to. Do you want to kind of speak about that and how that came about?
Sure. So, yeah, as I mentioned, I started with sort of the official sources, the war diary, newspaper archives. I found some German sources that were interesting. Having lived in Germany, I was able to read those, so was able to get some idea of the other side of the hill. But then during a period when I was living in Scotland, I visited historical societies in Haddington and Dunbar, local council archives, and found some personal accounts there. But then the thing that really sort of blew the story wide open, I think, for me was through the generosity of Jean Milne, who is the great-granddaughter of the commanding officer, Harry Younger. I was given access to his correspondence and his papers. So his letters to and from his wife, Anna, from mobilization up until the end in France in 1940, were available, along with other correspondence from the time and other personal papers and memoirs that he had written. So that really turned it from almost an academic exercise into something much more personal for me. I sort of felt like I got to know Harry Younger a little bit, who's just a wonderful character, and that transformed the book.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, the letters. So for the various papers you've got some of his troops writing to him, and
absolutely.
that's around the time of his kind of when he had to step aside as unit commander. There's a lot of sympathy there, and there's a lot of you can see that trust and that bond he had with his men. But I think
Mm,
most poignantly is the letters with his wife.
mm,
There there's some very moving stuff there, and I mean,
yeah.
what was that like
He,
reading through that for the first time?
it's hard to explain. It's hard to put into words. Really, the letters were almost chronological, so I was reading them in in proper sequence, and it revealed a few things to me about him. The first was how much he loved his wife, Anna. The genuine affection and respect and love that comes through between the two of them is really something. At times, I almost felt like I was intruding on that. Like it didn't. It was so personal and so private, so touching. So not everything made its way into the book. Some of that you felt a little bit like a bit voyeuristic or something. But so that relationship with his wife was so important to him. They were so supportive of each other while he was in France. They're writing back and forth, and he's asking questions about whether the dairy maids have had their bonus at Christmas, and what are the pigs getting to eat, and have you, are you keeping in touch with the other officers' wives and stuff. So he was clearly the sort of person who could think about all these things while he was in this difficult circumstance. He and the other stuff that came out from the letter is he's sort of a modern person. He was interested in what they called the Thompson diet. So instead of the typical kind of meat and two veg, perhaps of a British diet at the time, it favored things like fish and fresh vegetables and fruit and nuts and brown rice and brown bread. He was a reader. He was reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier in France in the early part of 1940, which had just come out. He was very politically astute. He wrote back to Anna at this point that when Churchill came to power in May 1940, that he thought he would be a good leader but wouldn't last long after the end of the war. Very perceptive. So he was a really well-rounded individual, a sort of true gentleman. And I don't want to go too much maybe into, I don't want to spoil the book for people who haven't read it, but there's a tragedy in the book surrounding him, and that tragedy came home very forcefully to me reading those letters.
Yeah, yeah. As you say, I think we'll leave that one for the discovery of the reader.
For the
But it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's very well. I think you've pulled together all of this information and you've created something which is brilliant. And I think generally this end of the war is perhaps less written about than the other end of the war. Of
Mm,
course, people prefer victories to perhaps defeats. Dunkirk is obviously immortalised in history, but perhaps St Valerie doesn't get the kind of the billing that it deserves, and probably
mm,
goes unnoticed even.
mm,
So
I think that's right. In Scotland, I mean, when I started to learn about the Lothians, I wasn't really familiar with that part of the war, of the fact that an entire British division was still in France after Dunkirk, the 51st Highland, famed, storied division full of famed and storied regiments, and that most of them had the same experience as the Lothians, which was either captivity, or death or captivity, really. So yeah, I think you're right. It's not as well known. Now, in the farms and crofts of northern Scotland in the Highlands, I think it is better known because there was such an impact of really the disappearance of that whole division on those communities. But in a wider sense, I don't think it is a well-known story. I think you're right. Yeah, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write about it.
yeah, definitely, I think you're helping to fill a gap for sure.
Fill that gap a little
Um,
bit. Right.
So I guess before we go any further, it's probably a good idea to take us back to the late 30s and set the scene for the book, as it were.
Sure.
Looking at the general kind of concept of yeomanry, you mention of their First World War activities.
Why aren't
And
you
then,
up?
well,
if you scroll
I'll
along
just
the
mute
top,
someone
you might.
quickly. There you go. Yeah, so their First World War activities, and then where they were placed or prepared, as it were, for the Second World War, what kind of state they were in.
Sure. Okay. Well, like all other yeomanry regiments, the Lothian and Border were set up just after the French Revolution, during the period of the French Revolutionary War. So this is the 1790s, when there's great concern in Britain that the French would invade. And so yeomanry, along with some other reserve type organizations, were set up to provide local defense in the case of invasion, and also to free up regular soldiers so that they could campaign on the continent. That local home defense was being looked after by these newly raised units of people that had very strong territorial connections. So they were raised by the Lord Lieutenant in each county, and so from the very beginning, they had a very local flavor, and the different yeomanry units around the country have a very distinctive local flavor, even to this day, I think, you know. So, I'll carry on. That's in the French Revolutionary War period, and they, I guess, they get their character quite early on. Even in maybe we can mute.
Sorry, hang on a second, Andrew. Cheryl, you keep coming back off of mute, and it's obviously disrupting Andrew's flow. So if you could avoid that, otherwise we might have to relegate you to watch it on YouTube tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Go on, Andrew.
My friend. No, not at all. Not at all. Thanks, Cheryl. Don't worry. So yes, that character of very local and sort of slightly feudal lasts even up until, I think, the 1920s and 30s. So the officers in the yeomanry in this regiment, and I think in most of the other ones, are generally local aristocracy or landed gentry. At the time of our story, the CO, Harry Younger, has just taken over from the Earl of Haddington. So the Marquis of Linlithgow, Earl of Haddington, and a bunch of other local aristocratic types have been commanding officers, really going back 100 years, as well as sort of Edinburgh haute bourgeoisie, the senior sorts of lawyers, those sorts of people making up the officer class. And in a lot of cases, the men working on estates or in the organizations that are represented by the officers. So they were a very tightly knit group. You know, these people all knew each other. So at the beginning of the Second World War, the officers were friends in civilian life. They knew each other. They socialized with each other, went to each other's weddings. Their wives knew each other. And they and the men knew each other well because they came from that particular corner of Scotland and had connections in civilian life as well as in the TA or the territorial army. So I just wanted to draw that sort of the character of that type of unit sort of starts with the local defense idea in the French Revolutionary War, but that it seems to sort of carry through. The regiment fought in the Boer War, so the first time they go overseas is in the Boer War, the Imperial Yeomanry, and then of course in the First World War. So the squadrons are detached and added to divisions as formation reconnaissance in the First World War. This is the role that they will also assume in the Second World War, and in fact that they have today, interestingly. So formation reconnaissance is the role of the Scottish and Northern Irish Yeomanry today. They're still doing the same job. In the First World War, they ended up fighting, of course, as infantry in the trenches along with other infantry. And there's sort of an interesting tie-in there, the experience of the group that we're following in the Second World War, they visit and fight in and near places that a previous generation of Lothians had fought in and near in the First World War. Amiens, Abbeville, Bayeux, other places that the sort of second generation of Lothians in France also visited. It's sort of an interesting tie-in to the previous experience.
Yeah.
So I think so. Or oh, I'm sorry. Actually,
no, go on, go on.
No, I was just going to say, you're asking what were they like at the beginning of the scene, you know, at the beginning of the Second World War, and I think a sort of fairly typical cross section of what society looked like at the time, you know, very different from the society that we have now. I think very much more stratified along those lines. And so I think the Lothians were a fairly representative cross section of the men, of sergeants and warrant officers, making up the real yeomen maybe, and then definitely a class of aristocratic or gentry as officers. Of course, that's not the case by the end of the war. You know, the Britain looks very different by the end of the war, doesn't it? It's a bit like Brideshead Revisited, I think. This sort of a lost society that no longer, that actually 4 years later isn't really there anymore. I think that's quite an interesting aspect of it.
Yeah, and as you say, Younger had obviously perceived how the politics were going to go. Obviously, with particular Churchill.
Yeah.
So even then, he probably, could see the way society was heading.
Yes.
But
Churchill said at the end of the war, you know, the lower middle classes have won this war. They deserve to win the peace. You know, they deserve to rule, having won the war. But it's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Indeed, I think what occurs to me about what you said about the kind of the makeup of the regiment. So in terms of, these were all local people, obviously to each other.
Mm-hmm.
They all knew each other, and worked or
Mm-hmm.
socialised, and holidayed or whatever with each other. Um, there's probably a lot of benefits to that in terms of cohesion, that kind of mutual understanding, perhaps that bond. But I suppose on the flip side, when a unit like this suffers losses, or people gone missing or captive, that
Yes,
must be quite an amplified effect in a local.
that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Hits home even more. A bit like the PALS battalions in the First World War, I suppose, you know, and I suppose it's the accusation that's made of the British regimental system that by focusing on recruiting in certain areas, you have that. You have wonderful unit cohesion, but then also perhaps a disproportionate impact in local communities when a disaster or something befalls a regiment. Absolutely. So I think that's absolutely right, and I think it was felt in the wider 51st Highland Division after St Valerie, all over Scotland. You know, in the Lothians and Borders, I think there are a few other units that men may have served in. You know, the King's Own Scottish Borders, the Royal Scots. There were other units, and so the effect wasn't quite as concentrated, perhaps, as way up north, when the really the only units that people served with were the local Highland regiments, and when they went into the bag in 1940, and all of the young men of a particular village or in a crossing area were gone, it was really, really felt there. There's an interesting story actually about that. As Harry Younger is scrambling to mobilize in 1939, just after the declaration of war, coming up to and just after the declaration of war, scrambling to get up to full strength in people and in equipment and weapons and tanks and cars. He still has time to suggest to the Secretary of War that reinforcements to his unit should come from Scotland if at all possible. You know, that he didn't want to take just anyone. And when they go down to England just before shipping out to France, They go for leave. Christmas 1939. A number of soldiers come back late from leave, and in a letter home to his wife, Harry says, you know, of all the defaulters, only one of them was one of our Scotsmen. The rest of them are these infernal English recruits who sort of didn't have the same unit pride, perhaps, or the same kind of cohesion. And so he noticed the difference there. Yeah,
definitely. So for those that are not familiar with the kind of geography, whereabouts
yeah,
are the Lothians and Border Yeomanry from?
sure. Yep. So over time, so from the 1790s through to the end of the war, and even now, it's changed a little bit, but generally the recruiting area is Edinburgh and East Lothian. East Lothian is that shoulder of the country south of the Firth of Forth that goes from Edinburgh really all the way around the corner down towards the English border. East Lothian, and Berwickshire, which is the eastern borders of Scotland. So there were subunits in places like Haddington, you know, the old county town of East Lothian, in North Berwick, the old royal borough and county town of East Lothian, as well as in places in Berwickshire. In Duns in the 19th century, there was a group of cavalry. So that's that area. It's the southeastern corner of Scotland, which is where my mum's family are from. You know, the part of Scotland that we visited when we were younger. We've got a few of them on the call today, and where my wife's family are also from. So the place names that come up again and again in the letters that Younger's writing back and forth, or that others are writing, are ones that are very familiar to me. It's a really beautiful part of the world. It kind of goes back to the wheat sheaf. You know, there are beautiful, large, productive farms in East Lothian and Berwickshire. There's a mound of moorland that sort of separates the two, which is bare and beautiful. You've got fishing communities on the Firth of Forth and out to the North Sea. It's just a beautiful little corner of the world.
Yeah, and I think in the book, you know, for those who read it, it's you go to a lot of detail about the area, and I think it's very clear you've got that familiarity with the area and in the way you're describing it at great length. So that I think really helps set the scene before the action, really, and you've really placed them in their homelands as such.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's such an important part of who they were. You know, the area is in the name. It's the Lothians and Border Yeomanry, and as you mentioned, you know, as we've discussed already, the manpower came almost exclusively from that area, at least at the beginning of the war, and so it was a very important part of who they were, I think.
Definitely. So just taking it back to the structure of the book for a moment. So how would you describe the overall kind of, you know, the sections of the book? What's the journey?
Sure. There are three sections really in the book, and they're called Beginnings, War, and Aftermath. So not particularly original, perhaps, chronological in that sense. In the beginning section, I try to set out, as you've mentioned, the place that these men came from, that the unit was from. What was it like? How did it inform them and who they were? Some of the historical backdrop of the French Revolutionary Wars and their experience in the First World War. So the where they came from and those beginnings, as well as interleaved with, I guess, the declaration of war and all of the preparations up until the point when they leave England to arrive in Le Havre in January 1940. So that's section one, the beginnings, historical and geographical background, and the lead up and preparations for war. Lots of interesting things that happen to the regiment as they get ready for war. Then the middle section of the book is about their experience as they go to France. during the Phony War, as they're with the BEF in Flanders, really, waiting for the German assault that everyone knows is happening and practicing for it. They called it the Phony War. In German, it's called the Sitzkrieg rather than the Blitzkrieg. Sitz means sit, so the sitting war. It's a much better pun, I think. The Sitzkrieg. It's a terrible winter. Back in Scotland, the Tweed freezes over in the winter of 1940. I don't think at Paxton anyway. I don't think it has since then, not to my knowledge anyway. Dispatch riders are sliding through crossroads and smashing into each other. You know, oil in the tanks is freezing. It's a really difficult introduction to operational life for these people who are essentially civilians. You know, during the 20s and 30s, they would be training for a week or two, as well as on the weekends, but a week or two in the summer. You know, these were not professional soldiers, and the way that they take down into these difficult operational circumstances before the war really starts, or before the fighting starts, is quite something. Harry writes back and says how proud he is of them for doing that. So in that middle section, they're waiting for the German assault, and then in a really fateful change, they are joined to the 51st Highland Division. They see it as a great honor. The Fife and Forfar Yeomanry are taken away to go back to train, and the Lothians and Border are attached to the 51st Highland Division as formation reconnaissance, as divisional cavalry. And they take their place in the Maginot Line with the 51st Highland Division. So they're separated from the rest of the British Expeditionary Force in the north of France and along the Belgian border, and they're much further south and east in the Maginot Line. So when the Germans attack, they're cut off from the rest of the BEF, and after, you know, holding the Germans up for a few days, they make a fighting retreat all the way through northern France, stopping and fighting at certain points where they're asked to, often covering a withdrawal or going to get other units out as they're being encircled by the Germans, until they finally end up at St Valerie, where the hope is still on the 10th or 11th of June that they'll be evacuated by the Royal Navy. There's a liaison officer with General Fortune's staff, but for a number of reasons that proves to be impossible, and they end their experience of war there in St Valerie. And then the third section of the book is aftermath. Really, we follow some of the soldiers as they go into captivity in Germany, some of whom escape. There are some great stories of escapers getting down to Marseille, meeting up with the Tartan Pimpernel, who was a Church of Scotland minister in Marseille, who made it his job to help escaping prisoners get back to the UK. So he features tangentially in the book. And then the aftermath. You know, I sort of follow the results of what happens to the 1940 Lothians in the aftermath section of the book. So it's really those three bits. Sorry, that was rather long-winded, wasn't it?
No, not at all. I think it just shows how you know, how much the book covers, and you know, I guess this is happening, you know, in a space of, well, you know, if you in terms of when they're sent to France, in terms of them
Yep.
when it all kicks off in
When it all
May
kicks off.
1940, and then where the book kind of pitches up at the end. It's not a long period of time. It's not like you're describing what happens to them over a course of 5 years or something. Um,
Right.
a lot happens, even when you consider it is in that Sitzkrieg, you know, phony war period. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's brilliant, kind of summary of the book. Touching on, because
You're right. Sorry, or just gonna say it's really only, you know, the Germans invade France on the 10th of May, and the 51st Highland and the Lothians surrender on the 12th of June. So it's only, you know, it's just over 4 weeks of contact, of actual maneuver and fighting. which must have felt long enough. But yeah, you're right. It's not a long, not
Indeed.
a long period of time. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, to winding back a bit, I think we've kind of covered the warm up act, if you like, quite well. So I think in terms of when they've got to France, and
Hmm.
they know, their role has been established, they're going to
Hmm.
be that divisional reconnaissance role. How does that? How are they shaped as a unit? What's the kind of the squadrons like? What equipment have they got, etc.
Sure. Um, so there are four squadrons in the regiment, including the headquarters squadron, and they're made up of a combination of tank troops. So each squadron had 3 tank troops, and those were made up of 3 Vickers Mark 6 tanks, very light tanks designed for reconnaissance, not designed for fighting. Size of a small family car, very little armor protection, and not a very effective weapon. So really a glorified armored car. And the other half of each squadron was universal carriers. So these were Bren gun carriers. I'm sure seen a tracked vehicle that was open topped, that was used for all sorts of different roles on the battlefield, to put from pulling light artillery pieces to acting as a battlefield taxi to extracting wounded. So the regiment was made up of a combination of those 2 types of armored vehicle. It's interesting to note, though, that, and we've got it in the book, the War Office during this period of the Phoney War writes a paper about the employment of armored units in the British Expeditionary Force. And they say, the state of training and equipment of these units is such that they should not be employed in complex maneuver warfare. They should only be used to counterattack an enemy in the case of extreme emergency, it says. They can be used to provide a screen in front of a defended position. They can be movable rather than mobile artillery support or light artillery support. But the War Office is quite clear that these units are not suitable for modern mechanized maneuver warfare, in Western Europe in 1940. They're just not ready yet, and they're not really equipped for it. Now unfortunately, fast forwarding to when the Germans crashed through, and I guess you could call that an emergency, they were used for all of those roles that the War Office said that they weren't really prepared for. In extremis, they were thrown in, to the fire, and by all accounts acquitted themselves very well.
Well, I think, as you
So
say,
the
being thrown into the fire, it definitely felt like they were almost used as firefighters.
Yep.
Being sent to where the action was the hottest, and
ab
they were obviously very well trusted. It seems.
Absolutely, yes. There are some interesting letters there from higher command saying, thank you very much to the commanding officer who comes in, Mike Ansel. Victor Fortune writes to him after the initial period in the Maginot Line, saying, how much he relied on him to help, and exactly that, as sort of firefighters, rushing around to the area of greatest danger, and covering units as they withdrew or removed, came out of contact with the enemy, which is a dangerous, time in a battle, is the breaking off of contact, of course. So helping units do that, going to where the trouble was the greatest, going out to find where the Germans were. These were the sorts of tasks that, once it really kicked off, the Lothians were asked to perform.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting there that they're obviously a civilian unit in the sense that they're yeomanry, but
Yeah.
very well trained, and perhaps in the context of the British Army of the time, they were perhaps one of the more advanced units in sense of the very mobile element. But obviously, in contrast to, say, the German army and the tactics that they'd developed to obviously use their assets, they then didn't stack up against them, certainly. But so it's this real,
That's right.
it's a real kind of, you've got to kind of take it in the context of the British Army, but then also in comparison to the German Army.
That's right. The British Army doctrine at the time of infantry tanks, the I tanks, the slightly heavier, better armored and better armed tanks, as opposed to the reconnaissance type light tanks that the Lothians had, reflected a sort of armored doctrine that had more to do with the First World War than with the Second World War. And the idea of armored spearheads that Guderian and others in the German army championed just weren't in place yet in the British Army. Now, it's possible to go too far on that and to sort of imagine that the German army was this modern and fiercely efficient organization that had way more tanks and knew what it was doing, and that the Allies didn't. I mean, Guderian himself had to fight in order to get that armored spearhead idea adopted, and it was by no means universally accepted by the German high command that this is how things should be, and famously even Hitler himself was nervous about the extent to which these armored spearheads had outstripped their own supply lines, around the time of Dunkirk, and asked them to stop because he was nervous about them getting cut off. So you're right. The picture's a little bit more, as ever, it's more nuanced than the image we often get. Yeah. There's one story about the sort of professionalization, maybe, of the Lothians that I'd like to mention if we have time, and it's about bowler hatting. This idea. So when the Lothians went to France, they went with the 48th Division, the first TA, or Territorial Army or Reserve Army unit, to go to France. And during the period of the Phoney War, while they were training as much as they could, there was a policy to remove Territorial Army COs and replace them with regular Army commanding officers. The idea being that they could whip the unit into shape perhaps more quickly before the German attack came. Everyone knew it was going to come, and that secondly, when the attack came, these professional soldiers would be able to fight their units more effectively than the amateur TA officers. So this happened to Harry Younger. He was asked to go down to the rank of major. And the process was known as bowler hatting because most of the people who were presented with that option chose to go home. Harry didn't, and he refused the bowler hat. He stayed with the unit, with the regiment that he knew, with the men that he knew, with what would be fatal consequences for him. But in the correspondence, we see letters from all of the officers in the regiment bemoaning this, complaining about the fact that there's going to be a new CO, saying, I joined this regiment because you were the commanding officer, and you've done so well by us over the months and years, and this is a terrible thing. The Earl of Haddington writes from Mellerston. He's sort of thundering in this letter saying it's the height of folly and mismanagement. It's a disgrace that you should be removed like that. And finally, the last letter received is from a guy called Ronnie Robertson. His mother lived in Gullen, which is where we lived in Scotland, saying, just thank God you've decided to stay with us. So you're absolutely right that from the point of view of the state of the British Army at the time, they were quite well trained, and they were very well regarded internally in the British Army. There were steps being taken to try to professionalize those units, even as the German onslaught was expected. For Harry, I think it says something about his character that he really didn't think twice about his reduction in rank, that he knew his duty was to stay with his regiment and his men, and that's what he was going to do regardless of what happened to him personally. Also very moving, I think.
Yeah, definitely. say it's obviously, with knowing the result, it's hard to say whether that's the right or the wrong decision.
Yeah.
Obviously, depending on how you look at it, but I think it was the right decision from like a moral stance to be with those guys and go to war with them. There
Hmm.
was someone though that didn't quite accept his demotion and continued to write letters to.
That's right.
How do you want to pick up on that bit?
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, um, his daughter, um, who was at school, whose school had been evacuated to Paxton, insisted on writing to Lieutenant Colonel Younger and not to Major, his new rank, his daughter Bridget, um, um, until he, wrote to her and said, "Look, you really must. You have to start calling me Major. It's the right thing." He, at the and around about the same time, he writes back to Anna, and it's as if he's more worried about the effect of this demotion on her than on himself. He says, "I hope you won't be affected too much by it," to his wife, and then says, in a bit of a pun, he says, "The rank is but the guinea's stamp. A man's a man for all that. So don't worry that I've gone from lieutenant colonel down to major. It doesn't really matter." A little coda to that, Bridget was present in 2016 when a building in Redford Barracks in Edinburgh was renamed the Harry Younger Building in his honor. So that quite nice. That family connection is still there.
Yeah, very very fitting. So let's get into the action itself as it were. So the pace now picks up. The Germans have kind of showed their hand and
Mm-hmm.
made their move on the 10th of May 1940. So what's the kind of the immediate effect on the Lothians of that?
Of the attack. Yep. The Lothians are in the Maginot Line, and a little bit like the Lothians from the First World War, half of them are in outposts, operating as infantry. They're not mobile. They're not in their tanks. They're in these outposts, keeping an eye on the Germans on the other side. On the 10th, all hell breaks loose, is how one of the officers describes it. The main German thrust is to the north of them, and the attacks that are happening in front of the Maginot Line are really holding attacks. But I don't think it would have felt like that to anyone who was there. There was a lot of artillery fire. There were German units, parties of infantry trying to infiltrate and break through the outpost line. So for the first 5 days, the Lothians, along with the rest of the Highland Division, are fighting in these outposts against German forces that are trying to get past them. The furthest forward outpost line was made up of what somebody compared to, or Derek Lang compared to, grouse butts, not very well prepared wooden structures that the French army had. This was 2 lines in front of the main Maginot Line. And that's where the Lothians do their fighting for the first 5 days or so, incur their first casualties, lose their first tanks to anti-tank guns. Again, do well. Fortune writes one of his letters to the commanding officer when things quieten down, saying, the help that you provided to us in the Maginot Line will never be forgotten. So there's 5 days of fighting in the Maginot Line, and then the order comes to withdraw. It's a very chaotic scene for the next 4 weeks. The Highland Division and the Lothians themselves are ordered back to Passy, north of Paris. Then there are orders and counter orders, marches and counter marches, as higher command try to figure out what's going on and try to consolidate in response to the German thrust. The BEF are still bottled up in Belgium and Holland. The French armies that the Highland Division are operating with are, forming and reforming, trying to get back, being cut off by the Germans. So it's a very fluid situation, and it's the one that we were describing before, when, as part of that, the Lothians are protecting flanks or scouting routes or going forward to extract units that have been cut off until at the beginning of June, there are two very important, from our point of view, engagements. One at Mareuil on the Somme, and one a couple of days later at Huismont. I'm sure my pronunciation is not very good, but at Mareuil, a squadron fights all day against powerful German attack. They have help from some French units that are with them. They hold them off for as long as they can, and then, you know, withdraw and set up further back. And that is the pattern over those days, is holding the Germans where you can at Valery and at Huismont until, you know, the time that you've been ordered to hold it to has been reached, or the unit that you're waiting to get to pass through you has passed through you, and then moving back to the next spot. So those two really sharp engagements at the beginning of June are probably the most significant fighting that the regiment does in the campaign. Really sharp fighting. A squadron in particular, 60% casualties on a single day. Not all killed, but a combination of wounded and killed. 3 days later, they are back in action at Huismont and operating as a unit. Something that the commanding officer is very, very, very proud of, very pleased with. So after those two engagements, they are moving slowly westwards and northwards to form a box, really a perimeter around St Valerie. There's some terrible sort of stories from that time. Like, as this is all happening, hundreds of thousands of French civilians are on the move and are blocking up roads and making it difficult for units to move, to maneuver properly. There are fears of the fifth column, of German spies being disguised as French civilians. The Lothians come across some of those. There's a little bit of panic at one point that a fifth columnist has been found, and in fact, one of the officers orders one of the men to shoot this person out of hand, and the situation resolves itself. There's another terrible story where, while retreating, after the initial engagements in the Maginot Line, as they're making their way through northern France, a lot of them hadn't slept for days. There's the story of a driver of a tank who fell asleep while he was driving it. They were sharing a road with a column of refugees, and falling asleep, the driver has run into a group of civilians, including a family with a pram, and has killed the child and one of the parents. You know, so there are terrible stories of that, you know, sort of the random waste of war. It's not just about the battles and the fighting and who was against who, or, you know, something as awful and banal seeming as a traffic accident was being experienced as well at the same time. So I found that quite difficult, you know, quite sobering or touching.
Yeah.
So after this terrible retreat, they end up around St Valerie, while the rest of the division is in St Valerie, and so they form part of the cordon, which is holding the perimeter, while Fortune and his naval liaison officer try to organize evacuation.
Yeah, I think just touching on a couple of things you said. I think you definitely you get that image of the human side of it, the fatigue,
Yeah,
the effect this is having on the men in terms of obviously their minds and their bodies. And I think when I remember reading the traffic incident for the first
mm,
time, it kind of stopped me in my tracks, no pun
mm.
intended, but it was it was awful, to read it, and I think, as you say, it's such a vivid thing, but you can imagine how easily that could happen
That
in
sort of thing. It must have happened all the time. It must have been happening all the time, and it's almost as if you're prepared for the tragedy of soldiers dying or killing or being killed.
yeah,
But the other collateral damage of war, that's experienced by civilians was really brought home to me by that
indeed.
story. Yeah.
So so as you say, so, after the events from the 10th of May leading up to, them finding themselves on the perimeter of St Valerie,
Hmm.
they were the rear guard, and they
Hmm.
were given quite clear orders, about, what point there would be an every man for themselves, kind of scenario. So do you wanna kind of
Yeah.
just pick up on
Yeah.
that side of things?
On that point. Yep. Certainly. So, if you think of St. Valerie is on the coast, the sea is to the north, and the perimeter was a box to the forming a western side, a southern side, and an eastern side. The Lothians Sea Squadron, Sandy Usher from Bedrule in Berwickshire, was on the west side. He was facing Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, hopelessly outgunned at that point. And there was stiff fighting there. We don't know much about it because um, Sandy himself didn't survive. So there aren't as many good accounts of what happened there right on the coast in front of Rommel's tanks as we would like. The southern part of the box was held by the rest of the regiment and others, but the Lothians were at an important route into north into St. Valerie. And you're absolutely right. There was uh, they were ordered to hold that part of the perimeter until midnight. When midnight came, and there are stories of units that had been in front of them panicking and running through them, breaking and running through the Lothians. The Lothians held there, of course. They were ordered to hold until midnight, at which point they would fall back onto the town itself, and the hope would be that the ships would be there. So it's a very evocative passage from one of the officers who were there. They smash up all of the equipment that they can't use. They render unserviceable some of the vehicles that they're not going to take with them because they're going to walk back. And they set out in broken step back to St. Valerie, and that's in order not to make as much noise as if they're marching in step that we think of with soldiers. So walking in broken step to get back as quietly as possible. When they get back to St. Valerie, the final entry in the war diary, the last entry in the war diary, it's written in hand, in hand, by handwriting, says they get to St. Valerie at 0200 hours on the 12th of June. It says, arrived St. Valerie, town on fire, no ships. And that's the end of the war diary. That's it until it picks up again much later in the war. So the St. Valerie is a fishing town. It's cobbled narrow streets and high walls and roofs. Roof slates are falling off. Buildings are on fire. Roof slates are falling off and smashing on the ground as the buildings burn. An air raid has hit a bank, and there are banknotes floating through the air on fire. It must have been a very unreal sort of picture that presented itself to the men as they walked in. And then, to your point, that's right. The code word for every man for himself is tally ho. And as soon as Victor Fortune comes to the decision that he must surrender, which is the only decision he could have made, I think, tally ho is given, and that means every man for himself. And at that point, many people stop, but other groups make individual attempts to escape. The two groups that we know most about are the group with Harry Younger and the new CO, who try to go west, towards Le Havre and other ports to the west. They meet with disaster. The major in charge of a squadron, Dalmeyer, James Dalmeyer, and his group go east. They find themselves at the top of the cliffs at Vaux-des-Roses, and with rifle slings and blankets, they make their way down to the bottom of the cliffs, seeing the bodies of people who had attempted that but slipped and fallen as they do, and they are picked up by a Royal Navy ship. They form the 3 officers and 17 other ranks who escape before the Germans finally close the noose, on St Valerie and take everybody captive.
Wow, I mean, you just can't imagine the scenes, can you? Carnage.
No. I mean, you can see why I was so fascinated with the story. As soon as I started to read about this, it's so compelling and tragic. Yeah.
So setting us up for the sequel, this is obviously but the start of the war.
Yes.
Lothians, as you say, there's a cadre of men who do make it home, thanks to the Royal Navy, and there's a part 2, which we're hoping that's going to be your next project. So do you want to talk kind of a little bit about that side of things?
Sure, absolutely. In 1944, after D-Day, as when the Allies returned to France to eject the Germans, as they're moving out of the Normandy bridgehead and along the coast of France and in towards Germany, Field Marshal Montgomery makes a personal request of the army commander with whom the 51st Highland Division are serving to say, and he says in his orders, all of Scotland will appreciate it if the 51st Highland Division could liberate St Valerie. So the regiment, the division, had ceased to exist really at St Valerie in 1940, and the reformed version of the regiment goes back to liberate the town in 1944. And in that liberating army is James Dalmeyer, who is now the commanding officer of the Lothian and Border Yeomanry. So he's last seen, as you saw on a ship, being taken back to England by the Royal Navy in 1940. He's awarded the DSO for his actions in the 1940 campaign. He reforms the regiment and goes back to France with them to liberate St. Valerie in 1944. So there's a really a nice sort of balance or symmetry to that one of the few officers who was able to escape took the regiment back to sort of to avenge what had happened in 1940. So there's a story there, I think, of Dalmeyer getting the regiment back together and taking them back to France. Yeah, that's without giving too much away. That's what volume 2 of the Lothian and Border Yeomanry story is going to be, I hope.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be an incredible story to tell, and I think it's a lovely kind of redemption story as such.
Right.
And that's not to say that they did anything wrong, because I don't think they did. They certainly did their job, probably more than their job. But obviously, in terms of an overall perspective for the BEF, it was perhaps a redemption. So.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to put the audience on notice. We've got a couple of closing questions, and then we are going to throw it over to your questions if you've got any. So if you want to pop them in the chat, please do so. or we'll give you an opportunity to come off mic and do that. So I think one of the things which I love about the book is the cover, and it's a very striking color scheme, and it's a significant color scheme. It's not just that you like blue. What can you just talk us through the significance?
Yep, certainly. Well, it's called French gray. I suppose technically it's not blue at all, although it is a blue shade, isn't it? This was the color that the Lothians and Border used for shoulder boards and other facings, the band around their forage cap, and later on the backing color on their shoulder tabs. So it was a regimental color that, oh, there, thanks, Neil. Yes. Their regimental color of their facings, their cuffs and sleeves and collars. Of course, the uniform didn't contain any of that in the time of our story. It's all battle dress, but that was an important regimental color previously.
Definitely. Oh well, thanks for spotlighting that, Neil. I'll remove you from the scene. There you go. So, and then my last question then is how, and this is probably the most important really, how do the Lothians live on today?
Yes. Well, that's interesting. There's a very obvious way, which is the Scottish and North Irish Yeomanry is one of the newest regiments in the British Army. In the British Army, reorganizations constantly are causing units to disband or reform or merge or split. And in the most recent version of that affected the Yeomanry in Scotland, E Squadron of the Scottish North Irish Yeomanry is the Lothian and Border Horse or Lothian and Border Yeomanry. So they exist today. They still have a formation reconnaissance role. So the members of the regiment today who still wear the wheat chief on their #1 uniform are doing the same sort of job. So their headquarters is at Redford Barracks in Edinburgh. And so that squadron of the larger regiment is the successor to the Lothians today, doing the same job, doing the same role. I suppose there are a couple, there are places in Edinburgh that commemorate people of the regiment, particularly Harry Younger. So on the Canongate in Edinburgh, which is near where the Younger Brewery had its headquarters, there is a Younger building that was built in the 60s and was used for youth groups, sort of community center, community hall youth groups. So that name exists still, as it does in Redford today. As I mentioned before, they've renamed the headquarters of E Squadron after Harry Younger. Some of the threads are still with us.
Brilliant, and rightfully so. That's excellent. So before we open up to the Q&A, we'll do the most important bit of housekeeping, which is where to buy the book. So the book has already been available on our website, barnformpublishing.co.uk. So you can order your copy through there, and that helps support us as an independent publisher. Alternatively, you can turn to obviously the mammoth that is Amazon, and it's been available on Amazon from today. Now, the particular interest point for that is it's very easy to get it kind of internationally for certain countries. So you may find that route better if you're ordering from abroad. But if you have any trouble, drop us an email at submissions@barnformpublishing.co.uk and we can see what we can do for you. Also, we've just started rolling out our ebook range. So this will be one of the next books to kind of be converted into that role as such. So there will be an ebook to follow in due course. And we'll make a post on our social media once that's available. So is there any questions? There's nothing in the chat at the moment. So does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question?
Yeah, I'll go first if that's okay, because it's actually about the cover, or rather about the title, Andrew. So some may be wondering about the Laugh and Be Happy.
Yes.
Can you touch on that?
Yeah, the regiment has a couple of nicknames that have come up over the years. One of them being the Princess Street Lancers, Princess Street, an important street in Edinburgh. The other one, they were known as the Loathsome and Bloodies because of the L and B, so Lothian and Borders, and just using those letters to create a nickname. They were known as Loathsome and Bloody. I didn't think that would be a great name for a book, though, because the other thing that they were known as, Laugh and Be Happy, simply picks up the Lothian and Border horse of the name. And so that was a nickname for the unit.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Good stuff. Anyone else? Okay, you might be a bit more vocal when I stop the recording. So Andrew, thank you so much. I honestly think it's been a brilliant talk, and you've really put the book across and your knowledge behind the book. So I'll thank you for that, and we'll stop the recording and then allow for any other questions after that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's been fun.